Thank you, Theo. Good morning or good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. I'm Aishwarya Suresh, and I'm a UX manager currently at Medtronic Diabetes. And today I wanted to talk about the various barriers we have to design when we are in this healthcare space. And so I wanted to quickly start with just an introduction about where I come from and what I'm currently doing. So I didn't always start out being in this UX field or even the healthcare field. I was a software engineer at NVIDIA, which many of you might know. It's a fairly large graphic chip maker. Um, but then I found myself quickly in the world of UX design. But I started out at Samsung designing mobile apps for a while. But then when I came across something like Siemens and just the number of products that they have, and it was so different from what I was doing on mobile applications, that I took that opportunity, and it was really my first entry into this health tech space. And you see that in Siemens and Medtronic both, I work on medical devices. So my talk is going to be a little bit more focused on designing for medical products. But nevertheless, like the strategies that I wanted to talk today can apply in any field, whether that's pharma or just, health technologies that you're working on. So yeah, at Siemens, I worked on a range of products, but I started out at this really cool ultrasound business unit, and it was such a massive project that I was like really amazed at how large my impact was going to be, just being one of two designers working on a redesign of the entire cardiac ultrasound machine. So all the hardware, we have a touchscreen component, and then also like a monitor where you see the ultrasound images. But it was just two of us working for a couple of years to redesign that entire solution. So it was everything from talking with cardiologists, and it was across Europe and China and America. And then really getting to understand what we wanted to do with this redesign and then going to the design phase. But that's where I really realized how big of an impact I could have as compared to anywhere else in the industry. Right now, I'm a UX manager, so I'm leading a team of about 5 people who are junior and senior designers, working on a bunch of different diabetes products. Within diabetes, I think there was a talk yesterday around the CGM, or continuous glucose monitor, that senses the glucose levels in the blood and communicates that to the patient in different ways. So products like that, as well as insulin delivery products. So people with diabetes typically need, if they are on the insulin therapy, they have options for a pen injector or a pump that automatically delivers insulin. So those are the kind of products that I'm working on. So it's a combination of hardware and which talks typically to a mobile application. And then there are a range of other supporting products. So yeah, that's a quick introduction about my background and where I come from and my experience in this medical devices industry. So today I wanted to talk about, just the various barriers to design that I've seen over my almost 9 years in this field. And that's mainly because how complex healthcare is, and then the landscape and the kinds of products. Like it's not typically just mobile and web applications. You have standalone medical devices that have a very different form factor, and you're trying to understand how a user, whether that's a patient or whether that's a healthcare professional, interacts with these various different medical devices. And so the three topics that I had for today were just the number one is constraints when designing for this regulated space. So those of you who have experience working for medical products, you'll probably have realized that there's a lot of regulations, whether that's the Food and Drug Administration here in Americas, or the GMED or EMA in Europe, and also Asia has their own regulatory bodies. So all of these constraints really constrain us as designers when we are trying to design medical products. And so I wanted to talk about what we can do to overcome some of these constraints there. The next is the time to launch a product. When I was at Samsung, it was pretty much every 6 months we had a flagship, and then every other month we had like new mobile devices that we were launching with our network partners. But here in this industry, just as an example, the cardiac ultrasound machine that I was working on, this was back in like a period of 2016 to 2018, roughly. It just got FDA approval and finally made it into large hospitals in 2024, just last year. So it was roughly 8 years long process of this product development cycle. And so it gets really frustrating at times when you're trying to keep up with the design trends, but also design for something, just future proof your design so it works probably 5 to 10 years later. And then the last topic is around just the various stakeholders that we have. um, yeah, so in contrast to any other industry, I feel like in this space, there are people like clinicians that you need to talk to. There are regulatory agents that are part of your own company that need to approve various parts of the design, and just so many different teams that are not typical for UX designers to interact with. But in my experience, there's just so many people that slow down then the decision making process. So just wanted to offer various strategies that have helped in making that process faster. Okay. Um, so starting with the constraints when designing for a regulated space, I wanted to talk quickly about this process called design controls. And those of you in the medtech field or designing for medical products, probably familiar with this or the various other standards that we have to follow. One of the key ones is this IEC 62366, which is like how do you design for medical devices. But design controls is an overall process that really, like me at Medtronic, all my teams really have to follow this design control process that's mandated by various regulatory bodies, so FDA or GMET for in our case. And so, what is this design control process? So, at a very high level, I have this diagram here to represent what it is. It starts at user needs, and that's easy for us to understand, right? We do tons of contextual inquiry to really figure out where the user is at, whether that's like a patient or whether that's HCP or any other, people in these healthcare spaces that who is our end user of our product. And to figure out user needs, we have various tools in our, in our UX toolkit to uncover true user needs. But this process, design controls, it wasn't written out with designers as mind, right? It is for really the entire organization. So yeah, it starts with user needs, which forms the design inputs. And this is where it starts to get a little bit more technical. So design inputs, we can just think of them as requirements. And these requirements are not just about the interface requirements. It could be anything from product requirements, hardware requirements, even software requirements. So this all goes into something called a design inputs bucket. But for our sake, like we could think about a UI requirement of, say, matching accessibility guidelines of minimum font size or minimum contrast ratio as being one of the design inputs or the UI requirements. And the next, it goes into this design process. And again, we are all familiar with that in terms of our UX process. But this is a process for everybody, whether that's in manufacturing of the product or people who are in the software teams. Everybody goes through this design process of ensuring that they've taken the inputs that's needed and then they're creating that design output, which in our case is the final design of our medical product. And so if it was accessibility guidelines as our design input, then we are ensuring that our design output, whatever we've designed, follows this accessibility guidelines, because it is one of the requirements. And so you'll see that verification, or this is simply, you can think of it as usability testing, making sure that whatever you have designed matches the inputs, but also like it is done with the actual end users. In my case, because I'm dealing with diabetes products and our end users are just patients, and these patients could be anybody. So any person who has diabetes, whether they're type 1 or type 2, like these are various user groups that you can define. But in our case, it's really anybody, and whether that's a child or an elderly person or an adult or people who need caregivers to administer insulin to them. So with all of those people with a range of ages and demographics, we have to verify that whatever we are designing works for them, they're able to use it successfully. And again, UX designers have various different methodologies that we can do to verify whether what we are designing is usable and useful. And so that's really verification here that's listed out as part of the design controls process. And finally, it's the medical device. So our design output could be, say, Figma files, right, with the design, the final design, which then the development team will take in, develop, and then it creates the final medical device. The design control is not just about the design process in terms of like just UX designers, like I was saying. It also involves creating the medical device in that manufacturing line, for example. So everything's governed by this design control process. And then the final box, or actually, I'll talk about reviews in just a second, but the validation is another big part of the process where we are checking whether the medical device that we finally created after probably years, does it meet the user needs. And so it's fairly a large study that's conducted for any product, like FDA, or in this design controls. Actually, sorry, the FDA and the IEC 62366 document, they talk about like the minimum number of people that you need to validate with. And we've had, as just UX designers, we generally know like maybe 5 or 7 users are able to get us to up to 80% of all of the issues that could be usability issues that we could uncover. But with validation testing, it's almost 15 people that we have to test with. And it's 15 people per user group. So, I was talking about the diabetes products where there are children, adults, and elderly, and it's 15 per user group. And however, this product team defines user groups, we have to test with 15. So that number could really be large. So I've been part of these validation studies that have over 75 people over a course of like a month or 2 months. And so it's very large studies that ultimately you need to make sure that whatever you've designed and developed actually meets the needs of the user. But of course, this is too late. Like we don't want to get to the very end of the process to understand that the product meets user needs. So it's very important to constantly check and adjust our design to meet the user needs. And the final box, really quick, is just the review process for every step along the way. So how does all of this fit in with us as designers? And everybody here is probably familiar with a double diamond process of human-centered design. So I won't go into any of those details on what these diamonds are. But we could apply our process throughout this design control. So as I was talking, I hope you're able to understand, like, okay, there are user needs, but how do we, as UX designers, uncover them. And, we have tools in our toolkit to uncover user needs. But in my organizations, at least the UX team or any sort of, customer team doesn't necessarily own user needs. So we have a process where an engineering team actually owns the definition of user needs and design inputs primarily. But this is where we need to come in as designers and help this team or somehow transfer ownership of this process to us, because really, who better to understand user needs than us and our researchers on the group who are focused on really getting to the heart of user needs. And so we really need to take advantage of the various tools we have, and help other teams to uncover these user needs. And it's not always contextual inquiries. I might be, harping on that quite a lot, but it's also things in the sales teams that they see, or the customer complaints team, which are getting feedback on what's wrong with the products that we have in the field. So there are various other sources that we should be looking at to generate a really solid set of user needs. And so remember, like with this design control process, we need to validate ultimately whether our device meets the user needs. So it's very important to create a very solid, very clear what our user needs are, nothing vague. And as we go through the process, that's going to help us define a very clean device that meets the user needs, rather than like, oh, maybe this device can also help this group, but that's not, it could have, but you need to focus on the primary user needs that you need to design for. Um, so yeah, I wanted to go next into like just the three things that I think that we can do with this regulated space. Is I was talking about the user needs already, but the second one is using this mandated verification activity to refine the design solution. So as part of the process, it's already like verification activities or usability studies are already part of the process. So that's already a big win for UXers across organization, because a lot of times you're trying to justify why you need to do a bunch of different usability studies to the organization. And especially if it's smaller and you have budget constraint, it becomes that much more harder to justify. But because it is already part of this process, it becomes a little easier. But it makes it on us, like, we need to pick the right tool to test our designs. And we know usability studies could be anything from just a simple task analysis to like much more sophisticated or newer things like eye tracking. But it really could be a mix of anything. So some of the formatives or verification activities are also called formative in this design control process, where these formative tests are really informing the design. And so you could really play around with the different research methods that you have. So in my case, when I was working on the ultrasound machine and I was responsible for doing a lot of these formative studies, we did anything from card sorting to like we had prototypes just made of foam core, trying to move around the buttons in an ultrasound machine and then trying to see which one works better. Like we were able to uncover differences in preferences across different regions. And then we were able to bring it back to our product manager and their team to make these product decisions and informed product decisions. So the FDA or these regulatory bodies do not care how or what methods you use, as long as you are conducting these activities. But again, because it's already mandated, it makes it easier for us to explore different areas. It's just a matter of pitching it to our product design, a product management team to allow us to conduct this and having the end goal of what we are trying to get through this study in mind. One of the other studies that we had done was around just exploring various different input methods. So in an ultrasound machine, which again, don't expect like anybody to really remember or know what the machine looks like. But there are various different input methods. Like they actually use a trackball to make measurements and to move around on the screen, even if it's a form where you're filling out patient information. And so our business was exploring, do we really need to stick with some archaic, trackball method, or can we go to a trackpad, which is much more, in the current generation, lots of users who are coming into this industry, lots of technicians who work on ultrasound machines now and getting trained, they really have to get trained on how to use a trackball, because nobody in this younger generation has ever used a trackball of that nature. And so we did a study on just comparing how input methods fare between the two that we were doing, like more like an A/B. But we use various different third-party softwares to get to a good, just an actual quantitative data on, how these two fare between naive users and experienced users. And we were able to make a product decision that now informed various different, ultrasound products that are in the market. And so the final point is propagating of this design thinking mindset across the organization. So the design control process, although it's very detailed, and I only showed it at a very high level, but it is very similar to our double diamond design process. So it's not anything new, but it is, in our teams that I've seen across, not just UX teams, they're not very familiar with our design thinking process. So, partnering with them to show how we as UXers can bring a lot of value and actually adhere to processes that are laid out by regulatory bodies, that really helps them, see us as a partner into this entire process and come to us for various different activities. Yeah, so that's the first point that I've seen is, just the various constraints of designing for a regulated space. The next one, the length of time that it takes to actually launch a product is really high. So my examples have just been over the course of years. The current products that I'm working on too, although they've been announced to the public, it's still a few. I totally don't know the entire timeline, because there's also a phase where these regulatory bodies, they just go dark on us and they're just evaluating, and it takes months, maybe up to a year even, for them to finally give an approval for a device. And then that's when we can actually launch it to the public. And so the time to launch a product is really multiple years. So what can we do as designers during this really long product phase? One of the techniques that I've learned over the course of years is called Trojan mice. And so Trojan mice are small, well-focused changes which are introduced in an ongoing basis in an inconspicuous way. And they're small enough to be understood and owned by all concerned, but their effects can be far-reaching. So this might be something that's new to many folks. This concept of Trojan mice, but it's very easy to understand. It is just conducting small experiments, and you might be doing this in your organization, not calling it Trojan mice, but this is a term that people are starting to use in organization, my own within Medtronic as well, where we're conducting these small experiments, and it doesn't have to be within a team. It's really anybody that thinks the way you think or sees a problem and wants to partner with you. And it's small teams, of course, like it says here, but it's also a very quick iteration or an experiment and trying to learn from that experiment. And so I want to talk about why, as designers, we should be interested in conducting Trojan mice experiments. and had this really quick diagram here that I found on the internet on how Trojan mice really works. And it's easy. Like you think of a Trojan mice, and I'll get to like what could be a Trojan mice experiment. But then you think of it, you deploy it, you observe and nudge and cajole it. So you're like probing what's going on in that experiment. And then you add or remove mice. So it's not necessary that every experiment you start needs to conclude. If things are not going well, it's best to just cut the losses, even though very small at that moment, and move on and add something different to the experiment. And then check the field. So it's not just one mouse, it's like multiple mice that are ongoing. And then so you're checking, where things are at with various different things at certain points and milestones, and then it's like a loop again to deploying more Trojan mice. So why should we be interested? Again, like I was saying, it's quick and small experiments, and these are things that it could be typically Trojan mice are process related. I was saying the time to launch a product, there are things where we can't really have much control of, which is just the review process by FDA, for example. They have a set timeline, but there's nothing that we can impact that. I mean, in terms other than like, providing a product that's really very well verified and validated. But other than that, it's just that time. But in the actual product development process, which is so long, years, what can we do to speed it up is doing something like Trojan mice. And a lot of these are process related, so quick and small, because you just want to be nimble. You want it needs to be okay to fail. So one of the beauties of it is that if things are not working out, you can actually learn from what's not working and quickly readjust, change the mice or just discard it and go to something different, and leave that part of the process as is. The other thing is you're learning fast, of course, that's understandable. And whether that's a positive outcome or a negative outcome, you are doing this at a very quick pace. It avoids getting stuck. So in Trojan mice is a term, I should have explained this before, but it's a term derived from Trojan horse, where it's massive. A Trojan horse is massive, and there are changes in an organization that happens from time to time, which are massive and driven, by efficiency, typically to the process. And so, but that takes a really long time, and they're in phases, and maybe there's still lots of things to improve with even this new process that the organization is trying to bring in. But that's where Trojan mice come in. And in my previous slide, there was this quote, where collectively a few Trojan mice will change more than one Trojan horse ever could. And that's true. Like if you're learning at a smaller scale, but then you just are quicker, and then you are able to cover a lot more ground or the same amount of ground that a Trojan horse could. You're still knowing which parts of the process that do get improved with these smaller experiments and which of the process you cannot. And so, it avoids teams getting stuck. And it's very easy for leadership to buy in. So in my case at Medtronic here, we have a very simple intake form that we do, or this team of leadership that's part of this Trojan Mice program. And we just, as somebody who wants to participate or suggest a Trojan mouse, I just have to fill in a quick form, and who my partners are in this and how long it's going to take, and effectively it's no cost. And so that's what leadership likes. And it's very easy for them to say, okay, it's okay for me to spend a little bit of my time and energy on something like this because the payoff could be big. And so it's a very easy process to get started in an organization, and you can do it at a very small scale, and then you could expand it to various other teams and parts of the organization. And then, so the last thing I wanted to point out is that it's many mice at a time. So I could be as an individual doing couple of them at a time. Obviously, if I do way too many, then that's like becomes my full-time job. But I could be doing a couple at a time. So it's not restricted just to doing one and, waiting a month or two to get the results and then, pick up. And so just imagine so many different small experiments running across the organization and learning quickly from what's worked and what's not, and then sharing those. So we come together to share what we've learned with others, or we quickly even deploy that change into the process. So some one of the ones that I had worked on, and we didn't call it Trojan mice, this because this was like 2-3 years ago before Trojan mice was introduced. But it was just looking at how we document various changes to the design. And so we came up with a quick process and of creating change logs. And it sounds very simple, but we have so many teams that we partner with that we needed to understand how best to create these change logs so that all the teams can benefit from it. And so it was just something quick that me and somebody else worked on together. Did a bunch of just talking to various stakeholders and coming up with solutions. And we started out with something, but over time it's refined into a really useful change log for everybody. And so with Trojan mice, there's actually an art to spotting, when you should do a Trojan mouse, and it's, asking questions of like, is this something that, is it a small problem or a big problem? How can we break it down into a small piece of something that we can experiment and find the right way to do it? And also like Trojan mice, it can change over time. Right now, what the organization or teams need from me as a designer is different than 3 years later when we matured into this process, and things can change. And at that time too, you could do a quick Trojan mice to understand what has changed and how to change your process. Um, yeah, so the other thing is finding like-minded people to do this experiment with is really important. So it doesn't need to be just, you as a designer and somebody else as a designer. Partner with anybody and you'll see surprising results and just different viewpoints that people have when it comes to solving a problem that you would think as a designer is pretty straightforward, but somebody in the marketing organization sees it very differently. But really partnering with somebody who wants to solve a small problem with you will get you really great results. So try to experiment by partnering with teams that are outside of UX and finding a problem. When you see it, you'll realize that yes, this could be a Trojan mice, and then pitching it to your leadership team. Cool. That's all about Trojan mice. And then the last thing I wanted to talk about is the various stakeholders that we have in our decision-making process. So I've listed out a few of these teams that I'm sure, in some capacity, you as designers have interacted with, through your course of just your career. And so we've partnered with like product managers. That's very typical. In this medical devices industry, especially, we have a very large team, almost as big as a UX team sometimes, that's called human factors engineering. And they really focus on making sure that the final end user is able to use the product. So all the validation and verification testing that I was talking about as part of the design control process, human factors engineers play a very big role in verifying the design and validating it. It's a good aspect of medical device design because somebody who is not designing is the one who's actually testing it with the end user. And so it removes a lot of different biases already just by having somebody different test out the product that you're designing. But they are a very big partner to UX design. And then you have medical science liaisons, who are basically the clinicians on the team. You're working with medical products. As designers, we don't have all that background, you can get up to one point, but really these liaisons help in bridging the gap between our understanding to like really the clinical world of how this disease that you're creating a medical product for, or really anything else, how they should make sense to the various different healthcare providers. And so they are another big partner for us. And then you have lots of the technical teams. So you have the requirements engineering, which will create all the requirements, the UI requirements, even. So you have to partner with them to constantly understand what these requirements are and to even, just to inform what these requirements are too. Safety quality engineers, they come with a very different lens of what are the risks to this one little workflow that you design, and they really just take apart the entire workflow that you have and think of what could happen in case of an adverse event and what are the various hazardous situations that are present, and whether that design by design itself you're mitigating a lot of the risks. So that's really the first line that the safety and quality engineers take, which is, can we when we're defining this product, can we just make it completely risk free by design? You'll see that a lot of these medical products, even drugs, you will get a little instruction for use, or a quick reference guide, and all of that also play into these into the safety requirements. So you'll see a lot of warnings that are listed out. It's not possible to have a lot of these as part of the interface itself, but you have to supplement them with things like this IFU or instructions for use documents. And then finally, software engineers and marketing communication. Software engineers, that's easy for us to understand. Like whatever we build, a lot of times UX designers are very involved in that first, software stack where we are closely defining that UI layer and actually developing it very closely with engineers. Sometimes designers themselves are capable of being that bridge to the backend team, but yeah, generally software engineers are a big partner to us in making the designs a reality. And then marketing communications and so many others. So what can we do to partner with all of these teams that we have? So one is bringing them along on the design journey. As you can see, there are so many teams, technical, non-technical, clinicians, HF, human factors, that is. And so how do we bring them along? So some of the examples that we've done as a team, whether it's Medtronic or in my past companies at Siemens, is we take people on these formative studies, usability studies. And one of the like a really early example that I have is back in like 2016, 17, when I was working on an ultrasound machine redesign. We actually had the lead software design developers, two of them, participate in that study. And I think, everybody knows the importance of showing our studies and what the end user is actually saying to everybody. But I really saw that change like about 8, 9 years ago when they were part of that study. It was very easy then for me to report out what the results were and to make changes to the design. Nobody wants to redesign things, and similarly on the dev side, nobody wants to like constantly keep changing what they've built. You'd want to like ideally design something really well, test it once, and then in the test is great, everything's good, and then whatever was developed can stay the same. But that hardly ever happens. And so it gets frustrating for teams like the software engineering team who think that we're just simply requesting for changes on the design side. But bringing them along on the journey really changes their perspective on what we do, and they're more willing to make those changes without a lot of resistance. The other thing that we've done is in Medtronic, we have this program called RIDE, RYDE, raise your diabetes empathy. And so there are people, so diabetes is a very common uh, uh, a disease that people have, whether that's type 1 or type 2. And so there's a lot of people in my organization itself, that are able to bring in the end user perspective. But for others, it's a just to understand what the users go through. We did this ride program where you, as just somebody part of Medtronic, could go on the field and really look at the users who are using our product. And you'll spend a day or two going from patient to patient and like really understanding various aspects of even training, like how do you train somebody who's new to diabetes and on these various technologies that are out there. And you don't have to be a designer to participate in this ride program. You could have been anybody in engineering, really any team. And there was a lot of people who are interested and successfully completed this ride activity. And you would learn very, very different things from each person and what they were looking for. And so there were extremes that you actually get to see through this ride program, where somebody was just in a very dire state and still not able to use our devices because of how complex they thought it was. And even though we think that, oh, we've tested it, we are doing everything we can to reduce that entry barrier, but you'll still see people who really struggle. And so bringing people along on the journey has helped a ton in just raising empathy towards end users, and that really directly impacts our work as designers. Second is take interest in their goals, so they're being our partners that I was talking about. So some things that are important to us, like we want to portray that to everybody, but there are also things that are important to each of these teams. So it becomes necessary for us to really understand what each team's goals are. So one of the things, just as an example, like a product manager wants to keep, or even a project manager even wants to keep things on track. So their main goal is to make sure that you're hitting all the milestones and the dates. And so really understanding with them what their goals are. This is a very simple example, but it could get even more complex. So really building relationships with various leads across the program to understand what their goals are, what they are trying to achieve, and partnering with them in making sure that their goals are still aligned with yours, and you are able to help them achieve their goals. So that just gives you a lot of goodwill, and the relationship I've seen, like if you have good relationship with various different team members, stakeholders, then that results in a very different product. That's you're able to do your work better, and ultimately the end user is going to have a better experience. And then finally, I have showing them the impact of the feedback. So a lot of times, you get really good feedback from a product manager or a clinician, and we change our design and we iterate on it based on just internal feedback. But then what we forget to do is, after testing it out, like really showing what that feedback did, with in terms of creating a better product that was tested well, and then really closing the loop on that feedback makes it so that now people understand the impact of the feedback they're giving. Like they don't want to just make an offhanded comment. They want to really think about what feedback they give you as a design team, and then it shows them the seriousness that you take towards their feedback and evaluating that and bringing that back. And so it could be both positive and negative. Sometimes we are sort of we need to take somebody's feedback. Maybe they are part of the leadership team and they really want to see something in the design, but you kind of as a designer question that. But one of the ways is to really test it out and then bring back that feedback on whether that worked well or not. And if it did not, then really showing them that we want to take their feedback, but we also want to really take what's important to our users. Yep. And so finally, I wanted to just leave here with a quote from Daniel Pink, and he's a very famous author. He also does a lot of TED Talks. But what he said here is that the drive to do something because it's interesting and challenging and absorbing is essential for highest levels of creativity. And I think like just being in this healthcare space, the complexity of it is challenging, and it's at the end of the day you're impacting patients' life, which is a big drive for us and for me personally, and really brings out how I can be very creative in my role to ultimately impact the patient's lives or the healthcare professional's life in a positive manner. So yeah, with that, I wanted to open it out for any questions. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Shwari, thank you so much for that. Really appreciate it. It was
Yeah,
fantastic.
awesome. Thank you.
As I mentioned to you a few days ago when we had our first chat, was that I'm a diabetes sufferer, and when you
Hmm.
were talking about the glucose monitor, I struggled
Hmm.
for about a week. I was getting the strips wrong, I was getting the readings wrong, and it was just
Yeah.
such a bad design. It's not your product, so that's rest
Hmm.
assured. Um, but it's also the thing is that whoever they tested it on, I don't know how they managed to end up on the shelves because it was not user friendly at all. But anyway, it's neither here, neither
Hmm.
there. I just wanted to say fantastic. Um, I do have a question here from Claudiane. And her
Okay.
question is, how do you manage a situation where regulatory safety requirements conflicts with your design principles? Like perhaps alert fatigue versus FDA safety requirements. I think it just popped up on the screen. I don't know if you can see it on your side.
Oh yeah, I can see it now. Yeah, that's a great question. So yeah, alert fatigue. So we're dealing with something like that right now for, the diabetes product that I'm designing for, where there's just way too many alerts. But we have a system, and I'm just taking the example of alerts here, where we have a system that we've defined various priorities of these alerts, and we've worked very closely with our quality team that does risk management, where defining these critical alerts are the only ones that are going to be alerted and have an escalation, whereas the medium or the low priority ones will have some sort of mechanism to inform the user, but it's not good to really annoy the user. So alert fatigue is a real thing in our products currently, and we constantly try to reduce it. But the way to do that is to see if there are ways to prioritize and just show the user the most important types of alerts, and if you can justify why certain ones, and maybe it's just removing a couple of alerts from your next iteration of the product, that even that could simplify, because somebody on a typical day could be getting up to 10 or 15 alerts from this one system. And imagine they're getting alerts from like every other application that they're using, but just 10 or 15 from their own ones, from this diabetes product ones. It's still a lot, but working closely with other teams to see if you can somehow reduce the risk is one of the examples. So you're still within that FDA guidelines of informing users of anything critical, but you're still working with your teams to reduce alert fatigue.
Great, thank you for that. Just another
Yeah.
question from Anna.